questions from the last session, and I may refer to some of them, but I think during the course of the presentation today, some of the questions might get addressed a little bit. So one of the things I want to talk about today is the challenge of making transitions in an organization when the community or the organization has been impacted by stress, distress, or trauma. And I think that that's, if you look at the work that all of us do, whether we're embedded in your county, for example, or I'm embedded in a variety of just systems, there are just literally dozens of ongoing processes that are taking place to consider the best way to do A, B, C, and D. And that may be the best way to bring kids back to school. That may be the best way to transition back into the workplace. It may be what is the best way to disseminate this information about trauma. We literally have dozens and dozens and dozens of questions and challenges that we're all trying to manage and discuss and disseminate at the same time that we're trying to take care of our workforce, and we're trying to take care of our families, and we're trying to take care of people in our community, and we're trying to take care of ourselves. And I think, you all have heard the term tipping point. I think many people are kind of close to their tipping point when it comes to just feeling worn to a nub, worn out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and hopefully provide a few structural suggestions about things that might be helpful. So again, most of you know, I think, if you don't, let me just tell you, I'm trained as a neuroscientist. So I tend to think about solving all of these problems through the lens of neurobiology. And as I think about the brain, and as I teach about the brain and teach about stress and duress, I use a model. This is a heuristic. And let me just make this full. Oops, there we go. So what I tend, excuse me, what I tend to do is, as I'm talking about a lot of these different aspects of how stress works, I use this upside down triangle model of the brain. And there's a couple things in here, and I'm not going to make it all that complex, but I want to explain a couple things. And many of you have heard this before, so I apologize if it's repetitive, but the model that we use is this hierarchical construct that has four of the main regions or areas of the brain laying on top of each other, kind of like they are in reality, a little bit like a set of blocks. And the base of this is the brainstem. It's a simple part of your brain that regulates respiration and body temperature regulation and everything like that. And the top part is the part that's the most uniquely human. It's a part of our brain involved in thinking. It's a part of our brain that allows us to sort of have complex language. When you think about the past, you're using this part of your brain. When you think about the plans for the future, you're using your cortex. So most of the things that most of the systems in our brain that we use in everyday life at work and in everyday interactions with our family, trying to figure out, what are we going to have for dinner? How do I help my children with their homework? Should we go back to school or should we stay home? All of that stuff is being processed by systems in the top part of your brain, the cortex. Now, here's one of the dilemmas of that architecture is that in order for you to think clearly, you need to be able to have access to and use the top part of your brain. And one of the major phenomenon that occurs when people are stressed is that by activating these core regulatory networks that are in lower parts of the brain, you start to shut down and make less efficient parts of the top part of your brain. And I think I talked a little bit about this last time. One of the things that we study and one of the things that we think is important to understand is what we refer to as state-dependent functioning. So when you're completely calm and regulated and you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you have no external challenges, you can be in a safe and familiar environment, not have a lot of intellectual demands, not a lot of social demands, you actually have access to this really smart part of your brain. And you can think about things, you can reflect on them, and most importantly, what you can do, and this is really important for the work that we're engaged in right now, is that you can take an idea and then think about how implementing that idea will work in the workplace. So if you think, oh, the way we should go back to work should be, let's let people go back part-time, and then your brain will go, oh, that might work. But then what you do is you actually are able to think about what that looks like. And you'll start to go, oh, one of the problems with going back part-time is this. And one of the problems with only half of the workforce going back means maybe the other half will be mad. And maybe the ones that are mad are going to feel like we're marginalizing them, or we're picking on them, or whatever you do. The point is, before you implement an idea, when you're in this calm state and able to reflect on things, you're able to anticipate potential problems with an idea or a concept or a practice, and then you refine it. You go, a better way to do that would be to do A and B as opposed to just A. And this is the beauty of the human brain. Our brain is able to actually try out a whole variety of solutions to problems. So you don't have to make 20 mistakes before you learn how to do something. You can make 3 or 4 mistakes because you've eliminated 17 of the mistakes by thinking about it. And again, I'm going to say something that seems very obvious, but here's the point. Thinking is a really good thing. Thinking is a good thing. Now, here's the dilemma. When you start to get stressed and you start to get overwhelmed and you start to get dysregulated, your ability to think starts to collapse. And this is what we call state-dependent functioning. And we know that this is true. People that get hungry, people get thirsty, people get overwhelmed, people that get sick, people that have too many things going on at once, literally start to paralyze and incapacitate some of the systems that are involved in cognition, particularly those systems that are able to anticipate the future, reflect on the past, and do that higher order form of planning that is related to what we refer to as executive functioning. So your executive functioning, everybody's executive functioning, your children, your partner, your supervisees, your supervisors, their executive functioning collapses under stress. And particularly under stress that is prolonged and unpredictable, or prolonged and extreme, which honestly kind of characterizes the situation that we're in right now. This becomes a huge dilemma. It becomes a dilemma for a variety of reasons. One is that whether you're in this state or in this state, you're living in a system that wants you to make a decision. You're getting pressure to make decisions. You're given time, time limits to come up with a plan. By this date, we need to know A, B, and C and fix it. And all of you, I think, have been in a situation where you're being pressured in a way that it is influencing your decision making. And so let me think I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little bit about decision fatigue. I think everybody in the last year and a half, whether you are simply staying at home trying to manage your children's education, or whether you're working and trying to manage their education, or whatever you're doing, whatever walk of life, wherever you are, it's highly likely that you've been involved in more decisions, making more decisions per day than you used to. And what we know is that when that happens, you start to wear out. I'm going to show you a couple of things here. Let me again go to this view. So this is kind of a conventional definition of decision fatigue. And one of the things that we know happens is that when you have to make a lot of decisions, the more you fatigue yourself, literally this is within hours. What this is showing is the percentage of favorable rulings in a parole board as a function of time of day. So when these judges come in, the parole board comes in and they listen to an argument, when they're rested and first thing in the morning, they've had their coffee, they're not hungry, they give pretty favorable, they consider all of the evidence and then they give a favorable thing. But as the morning goes on, they get more and more tired, more and more burned out, more and more exhausted. And then they finally have a break. And when they come back from break, all of a sudden they're considering all the evidence again. They're making more deliberate decisions. And so the luck of the poor parolee who comes in front of this group is completely dependent on the time of day that they're making their appeal is being heard. By the end of the day, after the sort of the afternoon break, nobody gets favorable reviews. This is a really important observation. Now, there are many, many other examples that show this, but what happens in decision fatigue is that you just start making, rather than considering all of the potential options and considering all the evidence and the nuances. Remember how I said your cortex is able to sort of take those 17 mistakes that you could make and run them through in your head and go, oh, we need to fix that. Your brain gets more and more and more categorical. And so what happens is you just decide yes or no. The decisions you make are more knee-jerk. And everybody who's been involved in this process knows that the more exhausted you get and the more overwhelmed the group gets, the more the decision-making becomes regressive and categorical and usually more punitive. Now, decision fatigues when you have one person or one group and there's a lot of decisions. The other thing that happens is when you have analysis paralysis, which means you have so many different sources of information and you've only got one small group of decision makers. And this is another place where systems run into trouble when they're under duress. There's a lot of things that have to be decided on and you're overwhelmed. And so analysis paralysis can really quickly become decision fatigue and people just go, yes, no, 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 no. And they don't consider all the nuances that could be at play here. So a couple of things that are really important. The reason we're able to avoid decision fatigue in most of our pre-COVID work is that we've developed a whole variety of routines and rituals because the environment hasn't been changing. I mean, the rules at work prior to COVID didn't change that much. We weren't having to decide how often you disinfect, how far away do we stay from people, when to wear a mask, when not to wear a mask, do you mandate vaccines, do you not mandate vaccines? All of that stuff, that wasn't even part of our life. We just had sort of our regular routines. Every once in a while, we might modify this, but the rate at which we were asked to make modifications to our work-related routines was much slower than the rate at which we're being asked in the last 18 months. Same thing with home. The routines at home, there were routines about getting kids ready to school, sending them to school, picking them up, doing soccer, doing whatever. But all of that just blew up. And the number of day-to-day, moment-to-moment decisions every parent has been making in the last 2 years is way more than usual. And it's exhausting. And the more exhausted you get, the more you start to shut down the cortex, which means that the less you're using the smartest part of your brain to make decisions about stuff. This becomes a really big problem in any work setting, and of course in any home. So there's a couple little things that can help. One, of course, is if you do have ways to create routines, rituals, and minimize decision making. Both Edison and Steve Jobs are sort of high profile examples of basically opening up bandwidth. He never had to worry about what he was going to wear. Never. Always wore the same thing every day. Edison ate the same meal every day for every meal. Every breakfast was the same, every lunch was the same, every dinner was the same. Didn't take an iota of bandwidth in his brain. Second thing is, again, we preach this all the time. It's not that hard to build into a decision-making process. It's thinking about the timing of your decisions. Remember the thing I just showed you? Don't make decisions at 5 p.m. when people rush in and go, we need to make a decision. It's okay to just say, I need some time. You will make better decisions in the morning than you will at 5 p.m. Everybody does. When you are in a decision-making mode, make sure that after every little decision, every time your group comes to a all right, this is the way we're going to do it. Don't just go on to the next problem. Take a break, regulate yourselves, take a 5-minute walk, go get something to drink. Minimize group decision-making. I mean, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to get rid of input from other people. But one of the most paralyzing things is when you try to be over-inclusive. And it's great to get advice. There's a very famous saying. I think it was, I think it was either Confucius or it was some very wise person. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong. But he basically said, take advice from everyone and follow advice from no one. Listen to everyone, follow no one. And this is important too. Again, all of these things are again, they're not things that you're not unaware of. But I think what's happened during the pandemic is that people who are aware of this, is that people have hurried into decision making. And they felt pressure from both internally and they felt pressure externally. And particularly people that are in leadership positions, I think have been really feeling highly vulnerable with this. And one of the dilemmas, of course, is that when other people want you to make a decision and you don't make a decision, there's a little bit of discomfort that goes with that. And the last thing most of us want to feel is more discomfort because we're already pretty dysregulated. It's kind of nice. People like to check their boxes. They like to end the day with all their little boxes checked in. It's hard for some people. It's really hard to leave their unchecked boxes. But I would recommend that you try to get comfortable with unchecked boxes. Here's a couple of things that are really might be helpful. You need to delegate certain decision making to other folks. And then you need to live with their decisions. This is a hard thing to do, but really what this means is that the most important work you do as a leader is choosing the people that you give responsibility to. It's selecting the right team. If you get the right people, then you got to then you can delegate, then you can stay regulated longer. You can be have the ability to have certain kinds of oversight. And if you don't micromanage, you will benefit tremendously, and the organization will as well. The other one, and this is really something that I think is a challenging thing to do, and this is maybe a little bit off topic in this presentation, but it's really helpful to have master routines, to basically have decision-making process that narrow, instead of having 17 options that you need to sort of think about, to just narrow that down into a couple manageable options. And a lot of this can be protocolized. And this is where you sort of have workflow algorithms. And again, there are some people out there who are listening kind of know what I'm talking about. If you don't worry about it. This fourth point here is again, this is temperamentally is hard for some people. There are just many times in government, and this for somebody who's worked in child welfare, a long time ago, somebody asked me about decisions about removing a child from a home, right? And they wanted to know, what's the good decision, what's good and what's bad. And I just said, listen, neither one of those decisions is good. This is just like, this is not good, but this is worse. And so in government, when you are in county government, you are always being asked to make decisions about things where the outcome of either choice is not perfect. The outcome is less than ideal. And you're sort of being able to manage and live with the point of diminishing returns. How much more effort, how much more energy are we going to help the community? Are we going to help the client? Are we going to help our organization that much more if we put in twice as much effort? And if the outcome is marginal, don't waste your time. This is again, I think this is one of the most powerful and important parts of leadership, is being able to live with that marginal, the margins, being able to sort of accept the fact that, we spent half as much time on this project, but we got 85% of what we would have gotten if we would have spent twice as much time. Now, the rest of the time, what we did is we were able to tackle a whole nother set of problems and address them with 85% success and 85% satisfaction. And that's again, that's the kind of burden you live with as when you're in a leadership decision. And this is one of the hardest things, is creating a regulated and regulating organizational climate. And this comes to the other point, is what's the difference between, remembering the difference between pushing off self-care to the individual and basically acknowledging that the organization can create a climate that provides care for the employees. There's no amount of high quality self-care plan you can put together where you put together a self-care strategy to kind of deal with all the crap at work. That's nice. That's good. But no self-care plan on the planet can overwhelm a poor organization. When an organization is dysregulating, you can sort of tread water for a while, but ultimately you'll drown if the organization doesn't create quality organizational care elements. And these are some of the things, again, I think are really important. So again, maybe a little bit off topic for the certain situation we have currently, but I will hope that some of you will come back and think about this. The one thing I want you all to think about at this point is transitions, the relationship between transitions and state-dependent functioning. So I'm going to give kind of talk about transitions from the perspective of somebody who does clinical work with kids. And a lot of times we talk about transitions in a classroom, transitions in life, but I'm going to talk initially about this in context of transitioning children from one situation to another. And I'll pretend it's a classroom, but then I'm going to try to make this relevant for organizational transitions, because that's what we're all dealing with currently. So if you've got a group of kids and they're engaged in activity one, let's say that they're playing in free time. And on this axis is so your internal state. You're calm, you're alert, you're alarmed. And this is sort of as you activate your stress response system and get really tuned up. This is getting into the area where you're completely terrorized and having a meltdown. Now, when you're calm and in an active alert state, you're basically engaged with the learning environment, with social engagement with peers. Now, if you're thinking about this from a work environment, you're basically able to learn new things, work with your colleagues, work with your clients, do your work well. But as soon as you start to get a little bit dysregulated and your stress response system gets high enough, you start to disengage. You may be in meetings, but you're not fully engaged in the meeting. You're not paying attention. You're tuning out. You may be with a client, but you're not efficiently processing and following through with your work. And then ultimately, if you get up here, you're just going to, you disrupt. So here you are in activity one, you're pretty regulated. Let's say that you've got the need to transition from one activity to the next. And what we use a term that's basically trying to measure the amount of change per unit of time. So one of the most important things about transitions is whether the transition is immediate or whether it's going to happen over the next 3 months. And so time is an important variable. When you take a child, you take a kid who's 6 years old, and you say you have to transition from playing in a sandbox to standing up and getting in line and going and sitting down and paying attention to math, and you give them 2 minutes to do that, that's a big challenge, right? That's a lot of change in a short period of time. And most 6-year-old kids can't handle it that easily. They have a hard time doing that in 2 minutes. It's very hard even to get adults to make a transition from a break time to come back and sit in the lecture. I have to laugh because I'll go give these public presentations, and we'll have teachers who complain all the time about these inattentive kids. We'll give them a 15-minute break, and after the 15 minutes, there's 10% of them are back in the room. And then after 20 minutes, 25%, and finally somebody has to go yell and pull them in, and then they keep talking. It's hard to make these transitions, even if you're an adult. So here's a delta C of 100. You have to make 100 units of change in 1 unit of time. If you are a well-regulated person and you want to get to activity 2, if you're neurotypically regulated, now remember all this stuff. Some of you remember that if you have lots of, the right pattern of stress activation, your stress response curve becomes neurotypical and you're pretty well regulated. In contrast, if you have lots of unpredictable, extreme, or prolonged stress, your stress reactivity curve is right here. So this person is going to manage transitions differently than this person. Now, again, I'm kind of talking about kids and trauma, but what I want you to hear, and what I think a lot of you are experiencing, is that your workforce and most of us have started to move off of this neurotypical curve, and a lot of us are feeling pretty dysregulated, more dysregulated than usual. So transitions are going to be harder for all of us as well. So here you have a neurotypical, well-regulated kid, and they're asked to make a transition. The very act of transitioning activates your stress response system. But after a certain period of time, they settle in and they're able to be engaged in this second activity. When we start to ask them to break away from activity one, they get a little bit, disengaged. They get to activate the stress response. They get up here. It takes a little while for us to re-engage them, but we get them re-engaged. Everybody is kind of has experience with that. Here's the dilemma. If you have somebody who is neuro dysregulated at baseline or overwhelmed, when you ask your workforce to make a transition that they used to be able to make very easily 2 years ago, if you ask them to make that same transition now, you're going to get a bunch of them that are just completely feeling overwhelmed. For example, I'm going to just throw this out there. It used to be that you could sort of say, all right, on Wednesday, everybody has to come in and do something different at work. You'd give an announcement. You might, send out a memo a week before. Most people would handle it. Or we're going to move buildings, or we're going to change routines or whatever. And most people would handle it. But right now, I'm telling you, the same people who were really wonderful employees, good to work with, they're not going to be able to handle these kinds of simple transitions anymore. They're going to be more likely to be either shut down and disengage, or they're going to be angry and frustrated and disruptive. Now, the way you manage that with kids is if you have individuals and you're making a transition and you don't want any of that disruption, what you do is you change the big transition into a lot of little transitions. And the way you do that is by using a whole bunch of little anticipatory communication and regulation tricks. Now, I shouldn't use the word tricks because they're not really tricks. But what you're basically doing when you've got a kid in pre-K and they're involved in playing in the sandbox, and you want to make a transition in about 7 minutes, you start going around and disengaging them from their play by saying, in 5 minutes, we're going to go and have lunch. And just the act of engaging them and communicating that pulls them a little bit away from what they're engrossed in. And then you start playing a transitional song right about here. And that partially distracts them and disengages them from this activity. And then you say, everybody stand up. We're going to sing the transitional song. And of course, the transitional song is pattern, repetitive, rhythmic. And so it has a regulating quality. And you do these little things, these little transition rituals, the pre-transition prep, using time announcements. You can change the lighting. You can tap somebody on the shoulder. You can do a whole bunch of these pre-transition preps. When you make the transition, you do it in a way that they're yoked, the child or the group is yoked to something that's regulating. They march, they do synchronous music, they clap their hands. Everybody clap. Now we're going to move. Now we're going to move. Now we're going to move. And you use the same music. So you've developed a transition ritual. And then after you make the transition, you get them settled into the new activity by having a whole variety of ritualized preparatory tasks. So every time you come in after transition from being out in recess, you do this. You sit down, you take 5 deep breaths, you look over at your partner, you say, welcome to math. And you look to the partner on the other side and go, welcome to math. And then the lights come on brighter and the music stops. You guys can figure it out, right? So with little kids, we know how to do that. And that helps these little kids, even dysregulated kids, make that transition without disrupting. Now, they may still be kind of disengaged because of their homeostatic regulatory state that's a product of their previous history of trauma. but they're not disrupting the whole class. Now, there are organizational transition things that you guys should keep in mind as you're making these transitions. All organizations, all human living groups have transitions. You know, they have they exist and they evolve and they grow and they change. And one of the predictable antecedents of any meaningful shift in organizational activity or change is a temporary regressive period. So if you're a healthy organization, you kind of have to disorganize to reorganize. And all of you have gone through that. You know, let's say that you reorganized, you know, this unit is now administratively under a different leadership group. There'll be a little bit of disorganization and kind of some bumps and stuff before they kind of get into their new equilibrium. That's just normal. If you are a distressed organization, though, these dips, these functional deteriorations are longer and they tend to be more severe. So the functional capability of the work group deteriorates, and it stays deteriorated for a longer period of time if the organization itself is experiencing extreme stress. And I would argue again, I think many of our systems are like that. You know, they've been overwhelmed, exhausted. You know, one of the things I've heard from many of the school districts that we work with is that they've gotten a huge infusion of money from the federal government to support all kinds of innovations and programs, but the workforce is so exhausted, they can't even sit down and plan and write a little grant to take advantage of the money that's right there that they can have. They're just too overwhelmed. And it's because they're being resourced at a point when they're just completely incapable of being responsive to that task. So organizational transitions, the equivalent of the little things we do in pre-K in organizations, have to do with this. You got to have a lot of communication, and way more communication than you would think would be normal for professional adults. And expect that even if you communicate some of this stuff to the group multiple times in multiple ways, people will still not process it accurately. They're going to read things where you were very clear in your email, and they'll come into an interaction with you and they will completely misinterpret your intention and the factual content of what was in the memo. And that, of course, leads to more escalation. And now the reason they've done that isn't because they're smart. Obviously, it's because of state-dependent functioning. You know, when you get dysregulated and your cortex, the smart part of your brain, is sort of less efficient, you have higher frequency of processing errors, higher frequencies of misinterpretations, misunderstandings, and they're also very labile. So if they read something that is a little bit misinterpreted, it might make them more angry. And once they're angrier, then they get less capable of hearing what you're saying. So anticipate that there's going to be a lot of misunderstandings and big feelings in these transitional processes. One of the things that you can do, and again, this wasn't prepared specifically for you guys, but one of the things that can be really, really important is that if this new transition involves giving people new responsibilities, and they're going to be using new software, or they're going to have new supervisory tasks, you got to prepare them. You need to give them the tools so that they can actually do the work you're asking them to do. When you start to make the actual transition, the equivalent of sort of a transition yoke regulation is to make sure that there's practices and policies that are regulating, that give them opportunities for getting on-site healthy connection, supervision, support, regulation. This is something that's also very important, having clear and realistic goals, but that they will be scaffolded by a mentor or by a engaged supportive supervisor in seeking those goals. Again, even if you prepare them for a new role, then you go, hey, it's your job, see ya, I'll see you in 3 months or 2 months, when we have your annual review, you can, I'll get a little feedback about how that's going. These transitions, the irony is many organizations skimp on that kind of work because they think it's going to take their supervisors more time. Any supervisor will tell you that they spend more time on managing dysregulated, overwhelmed sort of problems within the workforce than they do on their work. So if you do it up front when the person is not dysregulated, every minute that you spend with them when they're regulated and they can hear you is going to be the more powerful than 20 minutes you spend with them after they've been in that position and they're pissed off and they're feeling dysregulated and judged and incompetent. So if you put the time in up front, you'll literally save yourself time on the back end and they'll be more effective. And then after the transition, having in place clear outcomes, evaluation, supervision, and coaching. Again, all this stuff is kind of obvious, but these are some of the things that you will need. You may have all this stuff in place. Part of what you need to make sure is, again, the workforce is not going to hear or see most of this stuff clearly during this current time. So part of what you want to be able to do is remind people of all of the things that you already do have in place, provide opportunities for them to communicate proactively as opposed to reactively. Reactive communication, usually by the time you get reactive communication from angry workers, it's so late that you have to spend 3 times as much work getting them back to the point where they're regulated enough to actually be able to move forward in a positive way. And again, this is true not just about a workforce. It's true about schools. It's true about relationships with people, and et cetera, et cetera. All right. Oh my gosh. And it's 12:47. It's, let me take one last look at state-dependent functioning. I think many of you have seen this. Basically, what I want to remind you of is that when people are regulated, people feel safe, people feel engaged, they feel cared for by the people around them, they feel like they belong, they're able to use this smart part of their brain. But if they feel overwhelmed, dysregulated, unsafe, this is kind of where they are going to be functioning from. And if they feel like the system is respectful and will listen to them and will support them, they can kind of move this direction. If they feel like the system in their efforts to get help is ignoring, resisting, pushing, they're going to go this direction. And so obviously anything you can do to try to help people go here is going to, in the long term, be good. A lot of things that you do are going to inadvertently and not intentionally push people this way. And again, some people are going to be so sensitized because of their own personal experiences. And again, remember, not everybody's had the same level of distress. Some people have had all kinds of terrible things happen. Some people have witnessed shootings. Some people work in the VTA building. Some people are further away from that. Different people have had different collections of experience, and it's going to take, honestly, it's going to take exceptional leadership to sort of help people transition through this. But I have to say, it's completely possible. But I also have to say it's going to take time. You just have to be patient with yourselves, patient with the people you're working with. Because I can honestly tell you that these things don't go away quickly. I do a lot of work. Yesterday, I spent time with one of our colleagues who's in Beirut. And last week was the anniversary of the explosion of that big factory in that warehouse in Beirut. And you may or may not know this, but Lebanon is in chaos. And their currency has been devalued. All their bank accounts have been frozen. They only get electricity for certain hours a day. It's just completely collapsed. And so the process of helping people in these chronic situations, like the one you're in, it just takes a long, long time. And two really important things. One is the power of resting. And the second one is the power of patience. Be patient. And you'll get through this. You've got a lot of strength, that you've got a really dynamic community. You've got wonderful resources in the community. There will be economic resources that will be poured into this problem-solving process for you. But you want to make sure that your workforce is able to really take advantage of the opportunities that may be coming down the road in the next 2 or 3 years. But honestly, you need to look at this problem-solving process not as a 6-month process. This is a multi-year problem-solving process. And to the people who don't want it to be that way, they can push and they can huff and they can puff all they want. But the reality is it's going to take many years to kind of get back to where you want to be, or to get to where you want to be. There's no really going back. Well, that's really a good question, because the timeline will be a little different for each person. So, and I'm going to draw a little drive. Let me see if I can do this. I love to draw, and I don't know if I can draw. This doesn't give me can I do a whiteboard here? They've kind of changed well, then I won't do it. So here's the way this works. If you envision, let's pretend there was one major event, and we know there's lots of other things, but let's say there's a major event. Envision it sort of as a set of concentric circles. So the closer you were to ground zero, so to speak, the longer the timeline. So if you were impacted and somebody you knew and loved was killed in one of those events, that is a lifelong timeline. It doesn't go away. Now, you learn how to carry it, but you will still find yourself with all kinds of potentially evocative cues 20 years later. That doesn't mean that you can't be happy. That doesn't mean you won't have a good life. That doesn't mean that you won't be productive. It just means that that is always something that is part of the matrix of your existence. And it's anybody who's had an experience like that knows what I'm talking about. You can still fall in love. You can still do all kinds of great stuff, but you have this, you have this experience that influences who you are. If you're tangential to that experience, if you're kind of on the outside of that set of concentric circles, and it's impacted people you know, and it's impacted your work, your timeline to get back towards normal is much shorter. And so actually one of the hardest things for the people that are in this little concentric circle is that all the rest of the world around them starts to get back to normal. and you walk out on the street and you want to scream at people and go, don't you know that my child is dead? You know, how can you enjoy a movie? You know, it just, there's this disconnect between the smiles and the laughs and the things that are going on with your coworkers and other people that you know, when you're carrying around this incredible burden of sadness. And so there's that's part of that healing process, is to be able to get to a point where you're no longer offended by other people finding happiness. But it, you know, it's sort of like a slap in the face during that part of that transitional phase. For something like, you know, the work that all of you are doing, there's always going to be an echo of these experiences in the work that you do in your county. You know, the community-wide experiences have echoes that influence sort of the trajectory of cultures. And so I would fully expect there to be transgenerational effects of some of the things that we've been experiencing in the last couple of years.